So thank you. My name's Fraser Watts, and I'm here to introduce tonight's lecture on behalf of the International Society for Science and Religion, which has been convening these Boyle Lectures for the last 8 years. And it's a very deep personal pleasure to be introducing Iain McGilchrist this evening to give the 2026 Boyle Lecture. And I really mean that. I'm in no doubt about the huge importance of what Iain McGilchrist has been saying for some time and will be saying tonight. And I have huge admiration for him. He's one of the brightest jewels in contemporary British intellectual life, thoroughly at home and distinguished in both science and the humanities in a way that very few people can match. He began by studying English at Oxford and won prizes for his work in that subject. Then he was a fellow of All Souls College, where he mainly studied philosophy, including the mind-body problem. Then in a change of career, he qualified as a medic and became a consultant psychiatrist, having a distinguished career at the Maudsley Hospital. He's always taken a particular interest in neuropsychiatry and spent a period as a brain researcher at Johns Hopkins University. But it was his long and magisterial 2009 book, The Master and His Emissary, that led to his becoming the celebrity and leading public intellectual that he now is. And that book was followed in 2021 by his even longer 2-volume book, The Matter with Things, drawing out the metaphysical implications of his earlier book. And the long final chapter of that book on God is virtually a book in itself. At the heart of his work is the important distinction between two different modes of human cognition. One rational, symbolic, analytical, associated with the left brain, what we please to call the dominant hemisphere, though as Iain points out, it's actually rather limited in what it can do. And the other is a more silent, embodied, and practical mode of cognition that is indispensable, but often underrated. It's one of the glories of humanity that we have these two rather different modes of cognition at our disposal. But equally, it's one of the greatest challenges facing humanity to find the right balance between them. And at present, we're failing hopelessly to do so, as Iain warns us, with all the fierce passion of an Old Testament prophet. Religion might be helping us to find the right balance, but sadly, given the lamentable state of our national religious life, it's largely unable to help. To respond to Iain's lecture, we have the Reverend Professor Michael J. Reiss, Professor of Science Education at University College London, who is, amongst many other things, the immediate past president of the International Society for Science and Religion. But I don't want to take up any more of your time, and I'm very pleased to give the voice to Iain McGilchrist.
Thank you very much, Fraser, for those kind words of introduction, and thank you to you and the ISSR for inviting me to give this lecture. It's an honor. Truth is a noun only to God, wrote Rabbi Jacob Agus. To men, truth is really better known as an adverb, truly. This seems to me wise. Important is the perception that the seeker for truth should not be hoping to illuminate a what, but a how, not a thing, but a way of being. When it comes to the really deep questions, truth is not a matter of propositions, but of dispositions. Not by any means for any sentimental reason, but because those dispositions govern what it is you can see and know. And it just happens that this puts its finger on an important difference between the left and right hemispheres of the brain. So bear with me, if you will, while I give a very brief overview of such hemisphere differences, since they are important both for our understanding of truth itself and ultimately, I suggest, for discerning a path whereby we may come closer to an understanding of God. It is true that nearly all that passed into popular culture about hemisphere differences in the second half of the 20th century was badly mistaken. I believe that this is because we had asked the wrong question, the question one would ask of a machine. What does each hemisphere do? We had answers of a kind for a while, but eventually it became clear that both are involved in everything. If instead we had seen the brain as part of a conscious embodied being, we might have asked a different question: in what manner and to what end does each hemisphere attend to the world? And my choice of the word attend here is not accidental, for to compress a complex matter into a sentence, every one of the many highly significant differences between the hemispheres can ultimately be seen to turn on the question of the kind of attention paid by each to the world. This difference of attention arises from perhaps the most fundamental survival problem evolution could encounter, namely how to eat and nonetheless stay alive. What do I mean? Imagine a bird needing to pick up quickly a seed against a background of grit or gravel. To succeed at this, it must be able to bring to bear precisely targeted, narrowly focused attention to a detail. But if that is the only kind of attention it pays, it will not last long. It will fail to see the predator that will make it its lunch while the bird gets its own. Nor will it be able to look out for its mate or offspring. For all this to happen, it needs to be paying a completely different kind of attention. Attention that is broad, open, sustained, vigilant, without preconception as to what it may find. So difficult is this to achieve within a single neuronal mass that evolution has ensured that all creatures that have brains have two neuronal masses within them, each capable of maintaining a different kind of attention to the world. Once established, narrowly targeted attention has many other uses and can be applied more widely. For example, to the task of picking up and manipulating a twig in order to build a nest, and from there to many other purposes driven by utility. Different attention brings into being a different world of experience. What are those worlds like? In one, that of the left hemisphere, we know and recognize what is familiar, certain, fixed, a collection of isolated fragments or parts, things that are explicit, decontextualized, disembodied and meaningless, abstract, general in nature, and lifeless, but useful. What matters here is representation, which literally means being present again after it is no longer actually present. In other words, a deception, a two-dimensional version of the world, a schema, a theoretical model. It is like a map, vastly simpler than the world that is mapped. In a map, that is not a weakness, but a strength. However, we must be careful never to mistake the map for the world, as nowadays, I argue, we frequently do. In the other hemisphere, that of the right, nothing is ever completely certain or wholly predictable. Here we are always alert to the possibility that we could be encountering something new. When the left hemisphere aims to close down to a certainty, the right hemisphere opens up to possibility. What looks fixed in the left hemisphere is seen to be part of a continuous flow in the right. Everything here is ultimately connected and essentially relational. Where there were only parts, there are now wholes, Gestalten, that is to say, wholes that cannot be reduced to parts without loss. Here, the implicit matters at least as much as, indeed much more than, the merely explicit, and everything is understood in terms of the context in which it finds itself. This is a world composed of unique things, not just general types. It is a far more complex world than that of the left hemisphere. It is also animate. And in it, things are not just represented, but truly present to us, to use a Heideggerian term. They are not just passively there, but actually come into being for us. Although I cannot here begin to lay out the evidence given in great detail in the first part of my book, The Matter with Things, we do now know definitively that the right hemisphere not only attends better to the world, but perceives with greater accuracy, makes better judgments on the basis of what it has attended to and perceived, and is not only more emotionally and socially intelligent, but more cognitively intelligent than the left hemisphere. Good old-fashioned IQ depends more on the right hemisphere than the left. The left hemisphere tends to be frankly delusional unless under the guidance of the reality-orientated right hemisphere. What is of relevance to us here is that this way of attending, the way of being of the right hemisphere, is, as I shall try to explain, the only way of being that is adequate to an approach to the divine, and it is not the predominant way of being in our age of reductive materialism. It is therefore only to be expected that our age would have difficulty beginning on the path towards an understanding of the divine. A few further reflections on different ways of conceiving truth, then, before I turn to the relevance of all this for the search for God, or perhaps for God's search for us. First, truth is intrinsically relational. We live in a world which we often naively assume left hemisphere fashion to be composed of things, whereas, in keeping with the understanding of the right hemisphere, it is better seen as made up of relationships. Indeed, I argue that relations come before relata, the so-called things that are related. After all, they only are what they are because of the network of relationships in which they find themselves. In the Vedantic tradition, the god Indra cast a net across the entire universe, and at every point of intersection in the net is suspended a jewel in which every other jewel in the net is reflected. For me, this is a beautiful metaphor of the interdependence of all existence. But it also shows how the net exists in virtue of only two things: connections and emptiness, the threads and the spaces between them. When things are connected, there is not just an addition, but the birth of something new. The ultimate example of this is music, in which each note means absolutely nothing on its own, but the resultant music can mean, in some cases, everything. And the music arises only out of relationships. What's more, it is like the reality disclosed by modern physics, where what exists comes to exist through the relation with an observer, and the particles are the actualization at a point of a field of potential. What for a moment appears discrete is one way of manifesting an underlying, necessarily interconnected totality. Some of the consequences of this view are that making anything explicit or taking it out of context changes its nature, and that we are co-creators of ourselves and of whatever it is that exists apart from ourselves. Not creators, but co-creators. Ultimately, we cannot understand reality from the outside, but are immersed in it, and our understanding is and has to be participatory. Truth itself is a relationship, as the very word true suggests. Originally, it meant fidelity, and the word is related to trust. Truth and trust, belief, go together, and both are essentially relational. In a relationship, both parties count, and the relationship isn't a separate thing, but arises out of and contains the parties that constitute it. It doesn't lie in one or the other alone. Instead, then, of imagining truth to be a matter of bringing two pre-existing realms, one subjective and the other objective, as near as possible to mirror one another, we should think of reality as in constant creation, a reverberation, a resonance, a calling and answering between two, never wholly distinct, elements, one originating in ourselves, going to meet something that takes its origin from outside ourselves. This ever better accord or attunement is the evolving truth. It is intrinsically incomplete, but constantly in the process of completing itself. Uncertain, though constantly approaching nearer to certainty. Incapable of being grasped except through embodied being, through a consciousness that is in the flesh and engaged in the world. And along with this goes an understanding of what I call truth as unconcealing, a process in which something reveals itself to us only through our experience, as opposed to truth as correctness, a thing that can be determined once and for all, and into which nothing of us enters. Please note that nothing I say diminishes the reality or importance of truth. Just because there's no one single truth that is fixed and wholly independent of our knowing it, doesn't mean that anything goes. Far from it. What is required is an attentive response to something real and other than ourselves, of which we have only inklings at first, but which comes more and more into being through our response to it, if we are truly responsive to it. We nurture it into being, or not. In this, it has something of the structure of love. How is this relevant to the question of God? I suppose the first thing to say is that the concept of the divine is famously something in the face of which language proves to be wholly inadequate. The opening words of the Tao Te Ching are the Tao that is the real Tao. The Tao that can be named is not the real Tao. The left hemisphere insists that we should have a word for God, though in many traditions God remains the unnameable name, a way of warning us that when we have put a label on something, we believe we have captured it, grasped it, and finally pinned it down, which with God can never be the case. Language was developed for purposes of utility, enabling people to share an understanding of the steps to be taken in a practical task. Language refuses God, and God refuses language, unless it is the language of poetry. Poetry is when language is deftly used to subvert language, and that is why the language of ritual must work at the level of poetry if it is not to lead us astray. Language is the decent clothing of concepts. The sacred and divine cannot be reduced to any other concept or set of concepts. It is firmly and resolutely beyond any such approach. I think here of the wise words of the author of The Cloud of Unknowing. By love he may be caught and held, but by thinking never. St. Augustine warned us that if you think you've understood God, it is not God that you have understood. You might say, where does that leave theology? My answer is that we should be appropriately wary of theology unless it takes the apophatic path, the so-called via negativa, paring away falsehood so as to allow whatever is the truth to stand forth into the dawning light. Instead of anxiously trying to pin down what it is we're talking about, make clear our definitions and sharpen our scalpels, we need to adopt the opposite stance, not trying to force things into an illusory clarity, but waiting with disciplined attentiveness for them to declare themselves to us. We need what Keats called, in a famous phrase, negative capability, the disposition of the creative mind, which he felt Shakespeare possessed in the greatest measure, a capacity for being in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. Research has repeatedly and dramatically shown that highly focused attention, the type offered by the left hemisphere, makes us incapable of seeing even the most glaringly obvious elements right in front of us if they're not immediately relevant to the task in hand or do not fit our expectations. It is thus relatively incapable of the tentative, careful, in Heidegger's term, fürsorgend, reaching out towards what lies beyond what we think we already know. If intimations of its nature are inevitably implicit and cannot be made explicit, the left hemisphere will neither be aware of them nor capable of understanding their nature. Mystical truths refer to that area lying outside the familiar and everyday, where the left hemisphere view is, by nature, least reliable. But all truths of a metaphysical kind concerning the way things are will be best understood by the right hemisphere, the one that is turned outwards on the world so as to encounter whatever might be, and is less likely to ignore, simply not see, whatever does not fit the paradigm it already holds. If, as in the world made available by the right hemisphere, nothing is ever repeated or precisely the same as anything else, it follows that all is unique and fresh. Creativity is therefore part of the nature of the world, not an occasional act, but at the core of all existence. This is a world always in process, coming ever more into unpredicted being. If truth is a relationship, so are the ways in which we come to hold it, those we call knowledge or belief. Knowledge is of at least two different kinds, knowing the facts and knowing from experience. And in most languages other than English, there are quite distinct words for them. Compare the French connaître and savoir, and the German kennen and wissen. It is useless to approach God hoping for facts. Rather, we must remove the self-erected obstacles in the way towards experience. A similar duality obtains if we turn to belief. The root of the word is love. All that remains for us is the word leaf, familiar from Shakespeare, with which one described one's love or one's dear Lord. Belief is about a relationship in which, by definition, more than one party is involved. The believer needs to be disposed to love, but the believed in needs to inspire another's belief. Whether this amounts to being worthy of that belief cannot be fully determined in advance. It emerges only through commitment and experience. Etymology maps the slippage of thought. What it shows in this case is three revealing shifts. First, the words truth and belief used to describe a reverberative or two-directional relationship in which each party is responsible for the fit. For us today, truth and belief are no longer relational, but have become propositional. In the process, the causation becomes no longer distributed and reciprocal, but linear. Second, we note that truth and belief used to be embodied actions or processes involving commitment, not as they are now conceived, detached, disembodied things. Third, as processes, truth and belief derive their value from the context, could never be absolute, and were never single or static. These reflections on the nature of truth, knowledge, and belief show how each of them has shifted from something consonant with the world picture of the right hemisphere to that of the left, leading us to err in approaching the divine. In the ancient Greek world, a distinction was made between different kinds of truth, mythos and logos. For the Greeks, mythos did not have the negative connotations associated with our word myth, suggesting untruth, but was seen as indeed the only way of accessing certain kinds of truth about the world. Logos, equivalent to reason in the broadest possible sense, could serve everyday practical purposes, but was necessarily limited in its scope. Christianity is a mythos, and for me, the most powerful such mythos that exists. The left hemisphere's realm is rather like that of AI, self-referring and hermetic in nature, incapable of reaching outside its own system so as to see its limitations. The right hemisphere does not have to collapse experience quickly to the familiar, but can allow it to be intuited and allow the implicit to lead us out of the left hemisphere hall of mirrors. It understands metaphor, myth, narrative, music, and poetry. The richness of these implicit paths to knowledge, which also include drama and ritual, opens up an understanding of whatever cannot be explicitly stated without violence to its subject. Such means are essential to conveying religious truth. I've mentioned the impossibility for the left hemisphere of entertaining two apparent opposites together. It insists that one or the other must yield. Mentality is either or in nature. Fortunately, the right hemisphere is capable of accepting that both arms of a dipole may be true. It is capable of both and. We surely have uses for both ways of thinking, and both are necessary. But note that this in itself implies that the flexibility of both and at the next level transcends either or. In other words, we need not either or both and, but both either or and both and. I think this nuance seems to be lost in our contemporary society. We ignore the important insight that opposing factions may both express important truths. We seem to believe that if something is good in a certain context and up to a certain point, more and more of it will be better and better, or that there are hidden virtues in things we are inclined to proscribe. Because we can imagine the structure of reality to be rectilinear, rather than as I believe it to be spiral-like in its nature, we often push a single path of pursuit so far that we arrive back at the very point we wish to escape. This leads me to a very important point that lies at the center of all spiritual traditions. It concerns negation, having less, saying less, doing less, knowing less. With our view that we can, will, and must make our own world and make things happen in it, we tend to see negation as, negative. A constant feature of all mystical traditions is an emphasis on the creative power of silence and stillness. Value is placed on emptiness, non-doing, unknowing, and receptivity, as opposed to knowing, willing, and acting. But I must emphasize that what is being pointed towards is not what it first appears to be. In Buddhism, there is a well-known Sanskrit term, shunyata, often translated as emptiness. However, this is not a sterile absence, but a fertile potential space, such as is the womb, in which there is a place for something new to grow. Non-doing is not idleness. It is the disciplined holding back from the immediately obvious in an attitude of what I call active passivity, which enables something greater than we could have imagined to come into being. It is an attitude of pure audition. Similarly, unknowing is not ignorance. Ignorance is what we have before we know. Unknowing is what comes after knowledge, if we are lucky, and heralds wisdom. This openness to what is, without will or need to act peremptorily, is more characteristic of the mode of attention to the world of the right hemisphere than the left, whose nature is to establish, as far as possible, certainties and to will purposive action. With our too great readiness to assume we know everything, we crowd out the possibility of learning something that can come to us only through patient attention, literally the reaching out of a hand towards something not yet quite known. There is a Buddhist saying that the greatest prayer is patience. That tradition places letting go, reticence, withholding judgment and acceptance ahead of striving, judging, and knowing at the core of spiritual wisdom. Meditation, particularly mindfulness meditation and compassion meditation, tend to activate areas of the right hemisphere and still the dominant talkative activity of the left. Relinquishing control is part of ceding the ego to the self. There is a mistaken belief that wisdom must involve the loss of the self, but what is intended is rather the loss of the ego. Jung believed that the ego had a function in early life, enabling the individual to establish himself or herself as separate from the mother with which in early infancy it is fused. But with maturity, the ego, representing the self over against others, must be shed in favor of the self in reciprocal relation to others. Having no self is not only an impossibility, but those who have an insecure sense of themselves are deeply dysfunctional and cause much grief to themselves and others around them. Here again, there are important distinctions between the hemispheres. When I feel my pain, naturally, I do so in and with both hemispheres. When I feel your pain, I do so in my right hemisphere. There is something known as theory of mind, which is the ability to understand that another person or individual may not know what you know and may know things you do not know. This enables us to enter into the mind of another. Significantly, this faculty enables empathy in the right hemisphere and the opportunity for Machiavellian manipulation in the left. Seeing the big picture and understanding how opposites give rise to one another helps us make sense of so much that the left hemisphere's mindset cannot comprehend, and hence that we in the modern world cannot comprehend. One such truth is the necessity of vulnerability in its proper place. In a world whose main ideal is power, we aspire to be invulnerable. In doing so, we impoverish our experience of much that truly matters. In the Christian mythos of the incarnation lies the idea of the submission of a greater power to a form of constraint in order that something still greater can come about. This precipitation of limitless potentiality out into finite actuality involves an intrinsic sacrifice or self-limiting process in the interests of the being and actualized world and its beings at all. Again, superficial consistency renders us blind to the important idea of the dark side, and hence we make ourselves, yes, vulnerable, though not in a creative, but rather a destructive way. When we accept what we think of as negative in ourselves, we rob it of much of its power, and we open the way to change. When we deny its existence and try to banish it from our awareness, we lend it power to return and assail us the more strongly. There is a hidden dark side to what we think is just good, and often a hidden strength in what we too readily abjure. We should not forget the wisdom embodied for me in a Greek proverb, that when God builds a church, the devil builds one right next door. And then there is the reality that growth comes through suffering. People who have not suffered are themselves insufferable. The great psychiatrist Viktor Frankl, who survived the Nazi death camps, thought that suffering was part of the way in which we both grew our souls and, odd as it sounds, attained a sense of fulfillment in our lives. I think of a poem of Wordsworth's, composed after his beloved brother had drowned at sea in a shipwreck, in which he wrote, "A deep distress hath humanized my soul." Incidentally, several lines of evidence link depression with the right frontal pole, which is also the most important brain region in the development of self-other relationships and in empathy. Inevitably, understanding the human predicament nowadays involves attempts to understand what we've done in creating artificial so-called intelligence. I have many concerns about the countless ways in which it bears the potential to diminish and enslave humanity. But what strikes me most forcibly is the way in which it represents what might turn out to be the greatest ever, and therefore the last ever, push by the restlessly striving, intemperate left hemisphere towards its goal of unlimited power. Remember that the left hemisphere knows only a representation of the world, not the world itself. You can simulate reality, approach it asymptotically as far as you like, but you are no closer to achieving the reality you simulate than you were when you started. Many people find it difficult to understand that a length of an inch expanded to as many trillion miles as you can imagine is no closer to infinity at the end of the process than it was at the beginning. The same is true of asymptotes. There is a chasm we cannot leap across. The value of the left hemisphere being power to the exclusion of all else, responsiveness to all the other values of so much greater richness and importance, is very largely the responsibility of the right. I hold that values are not something that we invent, but something we discover or fail to discover as foundational as existence itself, ontological primitives that reflect the nature of the ground of being we call God. With the great German phenomenological philosopher Max Scheler, I believe there is a hierarchy of values, starting with those of utility and power at the lowest level, and rising eventually to the Socratic virtues of goodness, truth, and beauty, with, at the pinnacle, the sacred. The left hemisphere can see that there is something that we find important in the good, the true, and the beautiful, but approaches them, as it were, purely from the outside, accounting for them in utilitarian terms. Yet, unless one appreciates that they are to be prized in their own right and not for some ulterior purpose, one wholly misunderstands their nature. This condition of the left hemisphere is also the condition of AI. AI is, of course, capable of carrying out known procedures far more rapidly and effectively than human beings. But this has nothing to do with either intelligence or understanding. In this, it is like the left hemisphere in relation to the right. In both language and mathematics, the left hemisphere performs, by calculation, far more rapidly and accurately. But despite this important advantage, it understands less well the overall meaning of the linguistic utterance and is poorer at estimating an approximate answer to a calculation, once again suggesting a lack of understanding of what it is engaged in doing and what its responses actually mean. The element under in the word understanding preserves an old meaning of the word still present in the German unter, which of course can mean beneath, but can also mean among, unter Freunden, among friends. The word intelligence comes from the Latin inter and legere, meaning literally reading between or among. What this means is that to be intelligent or to understand requires the ability to make human connections and to read between the lines, to see what is implied, not just what is explicit, to realize the importance of what is not said as much as of what is, not just to put things together mechanically, as it were, from the outside, to situate oneself among a number of possibilities dependent on context in order to make a sound judgment. And the meaning of that context will always be human. We are, of course, embodied beings. There is a temptation to think of the body as an impediment, something that acts to constrain our vain desire for limitless power, including the power to defy death. But again, it is only through limitation that any one entity comes into being, as it is through the apparent constraints of nature, not the fruitless attempt to cast them off, that we are fulfilled in love, friendship, in the inexhaustible beauty of the natural world, and in the inspiring majesty of great art, music, and poetry. The body might seem to restrict us, but could also be seen as the only means of reaching out to the other. Nor should we forget the part played by embodiment in our relationship with God, who is not a remote, inhuman, abstract force, but an incarnate expression of love, capable of entering into and thereby redeeming the stark reality of human suffering. Everything we know is embodied and cannot be abstracted without distorting its essential nature. This is not to degrade the soul, but to raise up the body. With Alfred North Whitehead, I take the pan-experientialist view that consciousness pervades all that is in the cosmos. Spirit and body are not wholly distinct or opposed, but discernibly different aspects of the same being. Why would we want AI, given the risks it poses? The left hemisphere and its tools, one of which is AI, aim only for more power. We don't need to become more powerful. We need to grow in wisdom. It has been suggested that AI could be capable of spiritual intelligence. I've already given reasons for believing that intelligence of any kind, when applied to AI, is a misnomer. Whatever spiritual intelligence might be, and I'm not sure that the phrase is even appropriate, it must be seamlessly meshed with the body, its perceptions and feelings, above all, its capacity for relationship, and profoundly entwined with the experience of love, joy, suffering, compassion, and an awareness of approaching death, the very sources of human meaning. It must also be capable of imagination, a point that is of crucial importance. Imagination is close to the core of what it means to be human and has nothing whatever to do with fantasy. Fantasy is what takes us away from reality. Imagination is our only chance to enter into reality at its depths and thereby to understand it for the first time. Imagination alone is capable of that patient audition of which I spoke, through which, in a reciprocal process of calling and answering, something at first caught only in glimpses or snatches is nurtured further into being by our response. And that something is never purely generic in nature, but forever unique. Our uniqueness as individual human persons is rebuffed by the world of machines, which can deal only with categories, and for which all is fungible, endlessly reproducible, endlessly dead. No real thing ever fits into the brutal categories and boxes of bureaucracy and its machines. Your daily experience proclaims this. Assenting to this process is one of the ways in which we are forced to connive at our own destruction. Is there a left hemisphere contribution to the understanding of God? If you are an enthusiast for systematic theology, the answer would certainly be yes, since without its contributions there would be no system and no nicely classified concepts to systematize. But, as you might imagine, while I do not deny a place for such an exercise in abstract thought, I think it needs to be well hedged round with skepticism. By love, you remember, he may be caught and held, but by thinking, never. Those are the words of a mystic, of course, but I'm mindful of the words of the greatest systematic theologian of all time, Thomas Aquinas, who, in 1273, after an experience that came to him while saying Mass one morning, confided to his private secretary that, quote, everything that I have written seems to me like chaff compared to those things that I have seen and which have been revealed to me. After which he abruptly stopped writing, leaving his Summa Theologiae unfinished where it lay. And there are other more purely negative effects of allowing the left hemisphere to play too great a part. It privileges the written word over the visual image or music and tends to take the written word literally. It is relatively uneasy with unknowing and would hanker after certainty. It lacks an understanding of embodied worship, including the essentially metaphorical nature of carvings and icons. It does not see religion as historical and cultural, with its own context, but tends to see religion as timeless and universal. It would be quickly seduced into viewing religion as a way to control the uncertainties of the future, perhaps through the power of prayer, and that would bring its true believers power and material wealth. And it would be unable to accept the creativity of negation or active passivity, and would have a belief in its own capacity to make things happen. Finally, it would tend to see the dark side as simply something to be rejected and suffering as purely negative. Turning aside from its role in understanding or failing to understand the individual's path to God, it undoubtedly plays a very important role in the establishment of the Church as an institution, including its many monasteries, churches, universities, hospitals, and all the necessary infrastructure for its many good works. In the Lurianic Kabbalah, there is a story that I came across for the first time only about 20 years ago, and I have to say I was dumbfounded by the revelation it afforded me. It is a myth of creation, of the creation of all that is by the ground of being, who is known in Hebrew as En Sof. En Sof, being in its deep nature divine love, it needs an other to love in order to be fully itself. This is a story of the manifestation of the hidden nature of divine love, the unfolding of what is infolded, the precipitation into actuality of an infinite potential, perhaps even the discovery of its own nature by En Sof. So, what is En Sof's first act? To stretch out a hand and make something happen? No. It is to withdraw, so as to make room for something other than En Sof to exist. This is called Tzimtzum, withdrawal, the first act of creation. In the resultant space are placed 10 vessels to contain whatever should come forth into being. A single spark of fire falls out of En Sof and lands on the vessels, shattering 7 of them. This is the second phase, known as Shefarat HaKelim, the shattering of the vessels. But the shards of these vessels still contain sparks of divine fire. And the third phase of creation, called Tikkun, meaning repair, is one in which humanity plays a crucial role. For it is our destiny to put the pieces together again in such a way that the vessels are more beautiful than they were or could have been before. In this idea, I'm irresistibly reminded of the Japanese art form known as kintsugi, in which broken vessels are repaired, often with lines of gold, to produce a greater beauty than could ever have been found in the vessels while intact. There are just so many resonances here with what I've attempted to put across in this lecture. The ultimately relational nature of the divine order and of its creation, the necessary relinquishing of control, the power of self-abnegation, which puts me in mind of the divine kenosis in submitting to incarnation, and of non-doing as Christ submitted to death upon the cross. The impossibility of containing what comes into being within the feeble repositories of our conscious minds, the dignity of the human being and our contribution to a universe that is, as the physicist John Archibald Wheeler described it, participatory, and the redemption of what is broken, what is feared destroyed, and its return to life and beauty. It demonstrates the paradoxical nature of reality, creation and destruction together, and it validates the insight that myths are more important than any amount of legalistic prose. What great science, perhaps especially physics, reveals invites us to question our limiting assumptions. Undoubtedly, the practice of science requires the exercise of what both hemispheres are able to contribute. Analysis, reduction to parts, following of algorithms, linear sequences of steps are useful at an intermediate stage of the process. But most of the really great breakthroughs in the history of science have been made not by following explicit lines of thought, but in moments of insight, often when attention was directed altogether elsewhere. These radical insights are what psychologists, being an imaginative bunch, call aha moments, and they're robustly associated with activations in the right superior temporal sulcus and gyrus. In practice, science progresses by many more fruitful routes than the fabled scientific method, as George Gaylord Simpson, one of the most influential contributors to the reigning modern synthesis in genetics, pointed out. In the search for an understanding of the world we find ourselves in, we need science, reason, intuition, and imagination all to be brought into play, not just one or two. What we know is that while religion is largely incomprehensible to the left hemisphere, the right hemisphere is capable of understanding and sees more. And it is science that tells us this. Some scientists may not like this, but then science is more disturbing, more exciting, and more imaginatively insightful than it is often held to be. The great physicist Carl Friedrich von Weizsäcker wrote, "The first gulp from the beaker of knowledge estranges us from God. But at the bottom of the glass, God is waiting for him who seeks." The first gulp confirms our complacency, with deeper draughts from the beaker, with greater knowledge and experience of life, and that includes exploration of both science and philosophy. We are shaken free, and thus what we thought was in conflict is reconciled. Science that leads us to understand how our brains work brings us closer to an understanding of why and how we might have found ourselves estranged from God. But as we are assured, on the best authority of all, the truth shall set us free. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. It's wonderful to have you here. If I may say so, a true polymath and public intellectual. As Fraser mentioned, two of Ian's best-known books are The Master and His Emissary, which I understand has sold over 150,000 copies, and the more recent one, The Matter with Things, which is, and I have read it, 1,578 pages in length, and I gather has sold already over 100,000 copies, which is rather encouraging for those who say that people nowadays have a shorter attention span. And those two books have led to what we heard this evening. It's easy to think, when I think of the New Testament, as many of the scribes and Pharisees being too left brain and Jesus being right brain. But Jesus was capable of engaging in classic left hemisphere thinking. Some of you will remember in Matthew 22, when he's in an argument with the scribes and the Pharisees, and he asks them, whose son is the Christ? And they reply, of course, the son of David. And then Jesus says, how is it that David calls him Lord, saying, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand till I put thy enemies under thy feet. If David thus calls him Lord, how can he be his son? And then the passage goes on, nobody was able to answer him a word, and nor from that day did anyone dare to ask him any more questions. But the point is, of course, that in Jesus we see somebody for whom both the left brain, the left hemisphere, and the right hemisphere can be seen as fully functioning, but with the right hemisphere in charge. Though when I look today at some world leaders, I'd be quite content for either hemisphere to be fully functioning. It's also the case that sometimes the scriptures of any of the world's great religions contradict themselves, that makes it difficult for literalists for whom left hemisphere thinking tends to predominate. In the Gospels, for example, we read, my kingship is not of this world. If my kingship were of this world, my servants would fight. So, pretty clear, pacifist, conscientious objector stuff. But then we also read, though it seems less often to be quoted, let him who has no sword sell his mantle so he can buy one. We need both left brain, left hemisphere, and right hemisphere thinking, but as Iain keeps on emphasizing, it's better if the right hemisphere is in charge. As a schoolboy, I was very left hemisphere. At the age of 14, the only subjects I was studying at school were mathematics, physics, and chemistry, and thankfully, I maintain, though some of you who know me well might disagree, I maintain I have broadened over the years to have a somewhat more balanced outlook, though I do have a tendency at times to retreat to a very left hemisphere way of thinking. I don't know how many of you know the wonderful video where you're told at the beginning of the video to watch a basketball game, just an extract from it, and count how many passes are made. And the first time I saw this 2 or 3 minute extract, I concentrated flat out, 5 passes, 6 passes, 7 passes, and then somebody in the group with whom I worked very closely started to laugh. Well, of course, I ignored her. 8 passes, 9 passes, 10 passes. And at the end of the video, and I'm sorry to give this away if you don't know it, we were all told that during this clip of the basketball game, an actor appeared on one side dressed as a gorilla, waves his hands like this to the camera, and then goes off screen. If, like me, your natural way of being is very left hemisphere, you're quite likely not to see the gorilla at all, until, of course, the extract is then played immediately afterwards when you can't avoid seeing the gorilla. I am told on good authority that when this was done to a group of fellows of the Royal Society at the Royal Society, not only did none of them manage to spot the gorilla first time round, but when the psychologist then showed them the video the second time, several of the fellows completely failed to believe it was the same video, showing perfect left hemisphere thinking that the most logical explanation is that the whole thing was a setup, a forgery. The man was telling a lie. They were being duped. None of this, as Iain says, is to be taken in any way as a negation of the importance of truth, which at the time when we are living, sometimes referred to as a post-truth era, seems more important than ever. And when Fraser kindly introduced me, he said my day job is in science education, and I think in schooling we continue to have both the duty and an opportunity to ensure that young people are given a balanced education, one which does help both their left hemisphere to develop, their right hemisphere to develop, and, if possible, for them quite explicitly to be introduced to ways of thinking of how they can bring this together and develop themselves as rich people. The Boyle Lectures began in 1692, thanks to a generous provision in the will of Robert Boyle. Some of you may remember Boyle's law from school days. In its modern formulation, it's most often cited as PV equals nRT. Boyle was a founding member of the Royal Society, and Christopher Wren, the architect responsible for this church, was also a founding member of the Royal Society. I think, Iain, they would have both enjoyed your talk. Thank you.